You're listening to Messianic Insight, the live podcast from Kehilat Etz Chaim, Tree of Life Congregation in Toronto, with Messianic Rabbi Ben Volman.
We are going to pick up where we left last week, talking about the clean and unclean, but really we're going to be moving past Leviticus 11 as we discuss passionately the issue that quickly overtook the believers after Yeshua, which was not the issue of what was clean and unclean so much as who is clean and unclean. So that became an identity crisis for the Messianic Jewish community very quickly. And it happened with a great deal of passion. This is one of those interesting aspects of our faith. People get passionate and should feel passionate about what they believe. Now, it's a little tough when people get passionate about issues that seem like they're legalism. They're about being legalistic, what we call the letter of the law. But what we very quickly find in the community of believers is that the challenge turns out to be the clash between law and legalism. And this is a really tough distinction that we're going to have to talk about a little bit. But let's instead begin with talking about Rav Shaul and his passion. Here was a man separated by God who was confronted and given a task that would never have occurred to him. In fact, the very nature of Rav Shaul's calling just shows God's incredible sense of humor. Because he takes the relatively, unschooled Kepha, Peter, and makes him the great witness to Israel, which is known for its biblical scholarship. And it takes the biblically scholarly Rav Shaul and makes him the witness and the apostle to the unbiblical Gentile. But both bring a tremendous passion. And yet, what's interesting is that these passions have a way of having a residual impact long after the passion is gone from the person. Somehow the passion of Paul still remains with us. I want you to turn to Galatians 1, or just follow with me, because this letter of Paul to the Galatians is one of the most controversial for Messianic Jews. And it is a wrestling with those issues of what is legalism and what is Torah. We are very indebted here to the very hard work of David Stern in translating this letter so that we can see that the issues which are often brought out are very different, because Paul's passion is for people's salvation. That's what Paul was passionate about. And it's a good reason to be passionate. The salvation hope of believers. He was passionate because he had led people to faith. But he'd been gone for a while. He'd been gone and new teachers had come. And these new teachers, they were no longer interested in the same agenda as Paul. Their agenda instead was to make sure that Gentiles should be fully engaged with the legacy of Israel, the legacy of Torah. Therefore, they should be circumcised. Therefore, they should become attentive to all the law. Now, this is what Paul did not teach. And we're going to talk about why he didn't and why these issues are bound to come up. But listen to the passion. Let's begin with the sense of what was going on in the heart of this man. Because I believe he was moved by the Spirit. And we have to hear the Spirit. Sometimes, to really understand, we have to hear the voice of the Spirit rather than just, what are the details of the words? Listen. I am astounded that you are so quick to remove yourselves from me, the one who called you by the Messiah's grace, and turned to some other supposedly good news, some other gospel, which is not good news at all. Now that's passion, right? These are not words people usually use in a service. I am astounded. What is really happening is that certain people are pestering you and trying to pervert the genuine good news of the Messiah. Again, words we don't usually use in our services. But even if we, or for that matter, an angel from heaven, were to announce to you some so-called good news, contrary to the good news we did announce to you, let him be under a curse forever. Well, there's a guy who's ready to compromise, right? I might be wrong. This is an uncompromising statement that there is no other good news except that there is grace in Yeshua, and anything less than a full accounting of grace is not good news at all. That's the message. Now, Paul is passionate. He's passionate for these people. He's passionate for their salvation. He sees them literally being dragged into a new perspective which he never intended them to follow. Of course, this isn't the end. He's just getting started. He begins to describe his direct experience. And part of the issue here is what he's directly experienced with this teaching. And this is the problem. Here he describes it in Galatians chapter 2. And he uses this story which clearly happens before the events we'll talk about in Acts chapter 15. But here's the story that he saw, which describes exactly why he feels that the Gentiles are being mistreated, and to some degree, they are being undervalued, not appropriately valued, by those who are teachers in Israel. When Kepha came to Antioch, I opposed him publicly because he was clearly in the wrong. Yeah, that'll really win you friends and influence people, Paul. Comment like that. Yeah, you take the top guy and just say, well, let's cut him down to size. All right, let's move on. For prior to the arrival of certain people from the community headed by Yaakov. Now here he's talking about the Jerusalem community, of whom Jacob, the brother of Yeshua, Yaakov, led in Jerusalem. Now, Kepha, as he says, had been eating with the Gentile believers. But when these men came from Jerusalem, he withdrew and separated himself because he was afraid of the faction who favored circumcising Gentile believers. And the other Jewish believers became hypocrites along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not walking a straight path, keeping in line with the truth of the good news, I said to Kepha, right in front of everyone, if you who are a Jew live like a goy, not like a Jew, why are you forcing the goyim to live like Jews? We are Jews by birth, not so-called goyish sinners. Even so, we have come to realize that a person is not declared righteous by God on the ground of his legalistic observance of Torah commands, but through the Messiah, Yeshua's trusting faithfulness. Now, the story is a little bit skewed. David's language is a little bit skewed here, but the focus is this. There's a confrontation happening with Kepha. Now, it's a very, very strong accusation that he makes. You, who are a Jew, live like a goy and not like a Jew. In other words, he's pointing out that Peter, having mixed with the Gentiles, had been, moving in Gentile circles for quite some time. And now he was withdrawing as if he was compromising with those who now demanded Gentiles be circumcised. Why was this so critical? There are a number of important reasons. The first one is this. For every Gentile person, circumcision was a line that they found very difficult to cross. And I'll point it out as I have before, but I'll just describe the reasons again. First of all, because for Gentiles, who often were visible enough, their activities in the street often exposed them in ways that we don't expose ourselves today. But for Gentiles, circumcision was seen as an affront because it was actually considered a despoiling of the beauty of the male figure. And circumcision was an affront to Gentiles because it despoiled the maleness of men. It was something that the Romans abhorred. And it was very difficult culturally for someone out of Roman culture to imagine doing. It was not simply a religious thing. It was a cultural step that Gentiles would find very, very challenging to do. Of course, having the operation itself would be very, very difficult. So there was the issue of circumcision. The other issues are not just issues of following Torah, because Paul knows that when these people come in, they are not going to be satisfied simply by instructing the Gentile believers to live a biblical lifestyle. Instead, they are going to start placing on them the full legal instruments of what is called the oral Torah. In other words, they're going to start laying law upon law, and in fact, what's going to happen is that they are going to be made to believe that their righteousness before God is going to depend more and more on the extent to which they are immersed in legalism. And this is what Paul will not accept, because you are saved by faith. This is what the Gentiles needed to hear. This was the saving note to them. This is what he had tried to impress on them. And furthermore, he did not want them to go into legalism after he had so strongly brought them to faith in Yeshua by grace. For everyone who depends on legalistic observance of Torah commands lives under a curse. That was his point. His point was, and it's become, unfortunately, overly stressed as if legalism is Torah. They are not the same thing. The Torah is not simply about legalism. The Torah is about the primary understanding of the heart of observance before God. But legalism and adding further and further restrictions to Torah is what we so easily get into. So this is why he begins to quote, "Cursed is everyone who does not keep on doing everything written in the scroll of the Torah." Because as you know, what begins primarily as basics quickly moves to other issues which are added to it. So we begin by saying, let's make sure we are adhering to the Torah, but before you know it, we are talking about what letter says this and what interpretation needs to be added to that. Now, it is evident that no one comes to be declared righteous by God through legalism, since the person who is righteous will attain life by trusting and being faithful. In other words, he's quoting scripture. We are the people of God by faith. The prophet's message primarily was this: you attain life by trusting, that is, by faith and by living faithfully before God. Furthermore, and this was his last point, furthermore, legalism is not based on trusting and being faithful. So, here we have the challenge. What was ending up being called Paul's principle of law versus faith. And unfortunately, this was adopted by the church not as an understanding of legalism, but rather faith versus Torah. And that is almost like pitting God against himself. God did not give us the Torah simply as an obstacle. Paul says that, no, the Torah is a schoolmaster to lead us to Messiah. And indeed, that is the original purpose of it. There's no doubt about it. But the problem we face is this. When we get into Torah observance, we begin a pattern of trying to find salvation by righteousness very quickly. And when we do that, it is an endless road. I'll never forget. My brother became Orthodox in order to go to Israel. And he came to visit me in my apartment. I was single, living with somebody else, and I had him come visit me in my apartment and offered him some tea. Oh no, can't touch your cups. I said to him, oh, that's a relief. I had just dipped them all in pig fat, so this is great. Yeah. Why couldn't he use my cups? Well, because I'd washed them in dishes that had probably milk and meat on them. Probably. After all, I didn't keep kosher. Then, we began to learn how to function with his orthodoxy. At one point, for example, we had my brother and his wife come and visit from Israel. And we bought dishes specifically so that they could use them when they were in our home. And Sue said, oh, Ben, they're in the box. Why don't we take them out of the box and run them in the dishwasher? I said, don't do it. Sure enough, they said, thank goodness, they're still in the box. We'll take care of washing them. If we had put them in our dishwasher, they would not have been clean. Now, is that Torah? Right. But we quickly get there because we are so, we're trying to do it right. And then, of course, my brother said to me a few years ago, yes, we like living in our community. Of course, there are people who come to our home and they live an Orthodox lifestyle. It's an Orthodox home. He said, we have people who come to our home. They won't eat from our dishes. Not clean enough. They're not scrupulous enough. That's right. Is that Torah? Right. This is what Paul is concerned about. When you go down this road, it is an endless road. This is what is so painful for Paul, because he knows that the people he has brought to salvation are not beginning their journey into the Word of God in such a way that it will lead them to grace. But he knows that eventually they will end up with this conundrum where they will never be able to please enough those who have lived by legalism. And that's the truth. Talk about holier than thou. This is the real challenge for us. Now, the Messiah redeemed us from the curse of the law, he says. He pronounced in the Torah by becoming cursed on our behalf. For the Tanakh says, everyone who hangs from a stake comes under a curse. Yeshua the Messiah did this so that in union with him. Now notice what he says here. It's very important. Yeshua did this so that in union with him, the Gentiles might receive the blessing announced to Abraham. Notice what he's saying. It is extremely important here that Yeshua was cursed not for the Jewish people quite the same way, but for the Gentiles, so that they may be drawn into the family of Abraham. That through being, and this, the whole point was, so that by faith they might come into the blessings. And that we might receive what was promised, namely the Spirit. And this is one of the things Paul stresses. Teaching on Galatians is something that I've done in the past and certainly has its place. That's not all we're going to do today. But I want you to realize the passion of Paul is the salvation by faith of those who have come to Yeshua. That is his great concern. And we can't talk fully about all the answers that he gives because they become very complex. But he is most concerned that they should not go down a road of legalism, which he knows will be fruitless, in order to pursue the life of faith and grace and Spirit. Now, here's the further point that he's getting into, which is always being stressed. After all this passionate concern for the Gentiles, there is a certain phrase out of Galatians which every Messianic Jew has heard in preaching in the churches, and it's this one. Accordingly, the Torah functioned as a custodian until the Messiah came. This is similar to the phrase in Hebrews 8 where we read that the Torah is, passing. The covenant is passing. But that's not what it means. It doesn't mean that the covenants are gone. Neither would the Torah function as a custodian until Messiah came. But it doesn't mean the Torah is gone. For in union with Messiah, you are all children of God through this trusting faithfulness, because as many of you as were immersed into the Messiah have clothed yourselves with the Messiah, in whom there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free man, neither male nor female, for in union with the Messiah you are all one. And also, if you belong to Messiah, you are seed of Abraham and heirs according to the promise. Paul here absolutely wants all those who have come to faith to think of themselves as fully part of the promises of Messiah. But this is the phrase that has always been stressed. In Yeshua, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. And that is where we get into that whole issue. That's where we get into that whole issue of who is kosher. Not just what is kosher, but who is kosher. Because this is a phrase that is stressed. In Yeshua, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. But in actual fact, Paul doesn't actually mean here that there is neither Jew nor Gentile, because he neither means that there are not slaves or freemen. There's still slaves and free. And definitely we are still male and female. But what he is stressing is that in Yeshua, we have all received grace fully. And we are not to be separated. There is not to be one table for the Gentiles and another table for Jews. There is not to be one service for Gentiles and another service for Jews. There is not to be one spirit for the Gentiles and another spirit for the Jew. We are all one in Messiah. This, without legalism, without fear of losing our grace because we're not cutting it. We're not, we're not legalistically cutting it by doing all the things that some teacher from Jerusalem tells us we have to do. That is basically what he's saying. You are in Messiah for good, and nobody can take it away from you. That's what he means. Whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, whether you're male or female, slave or free, you are now in Messiah. Nobody can take that grace away from you. Except the way it's been interpreted is, God's thrown away Jews and Gentiles. We're now all one. Why are you worried about being Jewish anymore? And that's the way this phrase was interpreted. It's a very interesting thing. Because it's obvious when you look at the whole phrase that that's not what Paul means. And yet, that's the way it's been interpreted. And the fact is, Paul's passion and concern has followed him through the centuries. But somehow, once again, it moved us from what is clean to the issue of who is clean. His passion for those who are walking by faith, and now we're being compelled to live according to the strictest tenets of Torah, really made him react powerfully and strongly in the strongest language. Have I now become your enemy because I tell you the truth? True. These teachers are zealous for you, but their motives are not good. They want to separate you from us so that you will become zealous for them. In other words, they want to create new separations between Jew and Gentile so that you will think that they set the bar. And he says that does not lead to life in Yeshua. Does not lead to life in the Spirit. Eventually, Paul will have to take this argument to a higher court. And that is what happens in Acts chapter 15. It's interesting to me that the whole issue of legalism and the Torah is often discussed and more frequently discussed in referring to Galatians than almost any other letter. So that when Christians start talking about issues of legalism and how to understand Torah, they often go to Galatians. You know, I understand why. Because it is one of the most passionate, it's one of the most passionate letters that Paul wrote. On the other hand, it's written to Gentiles. And it's written in very particular circumstances. And it's also written in powerful language, which can be very convincing, but may not be a way of living for us when we are simply trying to rationally work through some of the larger issues. Because Paul was talking to a particular crisis for him. But what if it's not a crisis? What if it's simply the issue of how shall we then live? Paul was speaking out of a crisis. But Acts 15 is not a crisis. Acts 15 is a thoughtful consideration of the very same issues that are happening in Galatia. Except, instead of Paul being able to say whatever he wants, he comes before the elders which happened to include Kepha and Yaakov and the others in Jerusalem. The whole assembly kept still as they listened to Barnabas and Shaul tell what signs and miracles God had done through them among the Gentiles. And Yaakov broke the silence to reply, "Brothers, hear what I have to say." And first Simon, that is Kepha, had already spoken. He had agreed with Paul. He had agreed with Rav Shaul. Yes, we do not want to put burdens on them that we were not able to bear. That's the specific language Kepha uses. We were not able to bear. Now, Yaakov continues. Shimon has told in detail what God did when he first began to show his concern. Kepha also went on to describe what he had experienced in Acts chapter 10. Going to the Gentiles, compelled by the Spirit, and understanding that the Spirit was also for them. As God said through the Spirit in Acts chapter 10, "Do not call unclean what I have called clean." And he's not talking about food. He's talking about the Gentiles who yearn to have Yeshua in their hearts. Acts chapter 10 is not a menu. When the sheet descends, Peter doesn't leave and say, "Where can I find that restaurant?" He leaves and says, "What does God mean by this?" And then he realizes that this is an instruction for him to allow the gospel to now go to the Gentiles. And that's what he says. Now we know. Of course, Jewish people spend a lot of time and effort actually using some of the principles of Torah to stay away from Gentiles because of the way Gentiles lived. The way Gentiles lived was ungodly. And as far as Jewish people were concerned, you wanted to keep your distance from them. The terms that Jewish people had for Gentiles, based on their experiences, believe me, they were trying to keep themselves separate. And it was degrading language that they often used to describe their lifestyles. But Paul and Peter were now going out and speaking the gospel to them as well as to Jews whenever they encountered them. And Kepha was saying, look, what God has called clean, let's not call unclean. And then this is what Yaakov is responding to. And he began to show his concern from taking among the Goyim a people to bear his name. And the words of the prophets are in complete harmony with this. So now Yaakov says, look, this is what the scriptures have always been telling us anyway. After this I will return, I will rebuild the fallen tent of David, and I will rebuild its ruins, I will restore it, so that the rest of humanity, mankind, may seek the Lord. That is, all the Goyim who have been called by my name, says Adonai, who is doing these things. All this has been known for ages. Therefore, my opinion is that we should not put obstacles in the way of the Goyim who are turning to God. Instead, we should write them a letter telling them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from fornication, from what is strangled, and from blood. And you'll notice the key issues here. First of all, things polluted by idols, specifically the types of things which Torah says these are unclean. Stay away from them, especially as they have been polluting idols. But more or less, also, make your lifestyle in conformity with the instructions of Torah. Stay away from what he calls fornication, and it is basically sexual impurity. Also, he adds this instruction in keeping with Torah, that is, eat those things which have been properly killed according to Torah as you can. Specifically, those things that have not, animals that have been killed in a way which is quite, in the ancient world, this was considered the worst possible death, by the way. And then finally, from blood, which the Torah specifically says in Leviticus 17:11, I have given you the blood on the altar. It is the blood, by reason of the life that is in it, that makes atonement for your souls. So stay away from blood as well. He's basically saying there are principles. We call them the Noachic principles. They adhere to the instructions which Noah receives from God at that first covenant. At this point, the Goyim are not being given great obstacles. It has nothing to do with circumcision. Now, this means that Acts 15 is, at least for us, something closer to a guide for practice. And that is why it's helpful. For those of us who are seeking a guide, Acts 15 is thoughtful, and it points us towards biblical balance. The other thing, too, is Yaakov does not say, and of course, the rest of us Jewish people, since we're no longer Jews, will give up our culture. He doesn't say that. He says, we will continue in our congregations, and you Gentiles continue to grow and be blessed in your congregations. The biblical priority of Jewish practice for Jewish people and those who choose a biblical life practice is clear. They are not to worry about their Jewish identity. Secondly, the understanding that the culture of the Gentiles doesn't prevent them from receiving the Spirit as long as they adhere to biblical principles. In other words, you are staying in the faith when you live according to the primary biblical principles which we learn from Torah. And lastly, he also says this, and it's in the letter which I'm not going to go into further detail about, but in the letter he basically says, look, in every city Moses is read, and the Gentiles, if they choose, may grow in their faith in Torah if they continue to follow these words. I'm adding another section to our discussion about this issue because I think you need to understand one of the other consequences of the question of who is kosher. Because what has happened is that because of Paul's passion, there were effects on the larger church. But the real reason that Paul's passion meant so much to the early church was because they were able to take out of it what they felt passionately about the Jewish people, which is a desire to be separate. The early church passionately did not want to be Jewish. And they took Paul's passion and they applied it in such a way that they would be separate. I want to ask you this question. Why is it that Messianic congregations have multiplied so widely, but so recently? You know, it's been 500 years since Catholicism lost its grip on Europe, and yet, over that period of time, it's only within the last 50 years that there has been a rise in congregations of Jewish believers. This is a very interesting fact. Something about the perspective of Paul has stuck it out for a much longer time than you would have thought. First of all, I have to tell you, this past week I was reading a scholar who is extremely critical of the Messianic Jewish movement. And it was very instructive to me that essentially there's a lot of people for whom these issues have not changed. And one of the things that's kind of strange for me, and it's just the reality of the situation, is that Jews and Gentiles, of course, should be in one accord. But there are so many more Gentiles than Jews. When Gentiles start telling us how we should live, they should be aware of a few things. First of all, we are surrounded by a lot more options for them than for Jewish believers. If you want to follow the Torah, if God is leading you to follow the Torah as a lifestyle, there are not that many options. In North America, almost every denomination began as an ethnic church. The Anglicans are English. The Presbyterians were Scottish. The Baptists were often ethnic as well. I led a mission in Hamilton. Right behind us was a German Baptist church. I knew about German Baptists because there had been a German Baptist church down the street from where I lived growing up. Most of our denominations have ethnic roots. And by the way, if you are a Catholic, try in this city not to find a Catholic church that is not distinctly Portuguese, distinctly Italian, distinctly Irish, or distinctly some other culture, Filipino, etc. Most denominations are ethnically based. But they almost all agree that nobody should have a Jewish church. This is one of those interesting things. They will say, God said, through Paul, there is neither now Jew nor Gentile. In other words, Jewish churches aren't kosher. That is one of the consequences of this thinking. Now, I want you to understand something too. And this is part of the deeper roots behind what was going on in Paul's time and is still going on in Jewish thinking. There were always two views of what would happen when Messiah came. Paul and James actually represent the two poles of this issue. The first view, represented by Paul, is this. It's represented by James. When Messiah comes, the Jewish people will be more passionately zealous for the law because it will be written on our hearts and the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth. That was one perspective. It was usually identified with the house of Shammai. In other words, this was a house that was, by the way, more legalistic. But there was another view, represented by the view of the house of Hillel, under which Paul was taught. In their view, when Messiah comes, the law will be of no effect because it will be written on our hearts and knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth. You notice that both perspectives are rooted in the same scriptural issues. Both use exactly the same reasons for saying everyone will follow the law more scrupulously, Or we'll all be free from the law because it's just because the law is just a custodian until Messiah comes. These were two different perspectives. And you know what's really interesting to me is that when you come to faith in Yeshua as a Jewish believer, you'll find both kinds of perspectives still today. So that when Jewish people actually come to faith, you'll find there are some who adhere to the house of Shammai, and they will say, we are going to be more Orthodox than the Orthodox, just like Yeshua said. We are going to be more Pharisee than the Pharisees. And there are others who will say, wait a minute, for freedom I was set free. You know what the curiosity is? Here's the curiosity. Often the people who are more passionately zealous for the law grew up secular. And often the people who are focused on freedom grew up Orthodox. That's not always true, but I'm surprised how often it is true. This is one of the curiosities of grappling with this issue. I'm sorry that I've gone into such detail, but I want you to realize that the issue of who is kosher really here shows you why these two different groups will completely exclude each other. And sometimes that becomes an issue which separates us as if the Spirit separated us. But it's not meant to be that way. The practical reality among Jewish and Gentile believers is that some become more scrupulously responsible and others seize hold of freedom. It's true even amongst Gentiles. And many Jewish believers who come to faith become more zealous for their identity. The truth is, most Jewish people who come to the Lord never felt so Jewish as when they come to believe in Yeshua. And so when the church says to them, look, now you've come to Jesus, give up that Jewish identity, that does not work. That's the problem. I want you to take a look very briefly at how Paul lays this out in the book of Romans, because I'm going to show you a chapter there that is never spoken about. Of course, he emphasizes the fact that Gentiles, when he speaks to them, are supposed to give the Jewish people a provocation to jealousy because of their faith in Yeshua, faith in Messiah. But he also warns them, you will say branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. But so what? They were broken off because of their lack of trust. You should keep your place. You can keep your place only because of your trust. So don't be arrogant. On the contrary, be terrified. In other words, Paul is emphasizing Gentiles don't be arrogant against Jewish people. So take a good look at God's kindness and his severity. On the other hand, God's kindness toward you. Moreover, if they do not persist in their lack of trust, they will be grafted in because God is able to graft them back in. Now, this is what we should be stressing here. God is able to graft them back in. And then he says this in Romans 15, and I've never heard this preached on. Never. Look at what he says. This is his vision of unity. Welcome each other. He has just been talking about what he calls the weaker and stronger brother. It's really the two types of people. One type of person calls the other too kosher. The other one says, not kosher enough. And he talks about these two types of people because that's what we find in our congregations. And they're still here. They're in our congregation too. There are people here. yes, we must be really adhering to the law of Moshe. And others who say, wait a minute, for freedom I was set free. This is what Paul says. This is what Rav Shaul says. When you get together, welcome each other just as the Messiah has welcomed you into God's glory. For I say that the Messiah became a servant of the Jewish people in order to show God's truthfulness by making good his promises to the patriarchs, and in order to show his mercy by causing the Gentiles to glorify God. As it is written in the Tanakh, because of this I will acknowledge your name among the Gentiles and sing praise to your name. See, he's saying, learn to live with each other, whether you're Jewish or Gentile, whether you're scrupulous for the law or you believe in freedom. This is how we should understand who is kosher. Again, of course, the shadow of Nicaea. After 325, the church rips apart the unity of Jew and Gentile. They sever the root. They not only create a separation, they begin to foster hate, and they begin to tell the church, you cannot have fellowship with Jewish people, and eventually the church becomes an oppressive force against the Jewish people. And even more cruelly for me is to read theologians like I did this past week who keep saying, hey, look, you know what? This is what God intended anyway. After all, see how many more children we've given Abraham, and it doesn't, Jewish people have fallen away, but that's unimportant. We've given Abraham so many more children. And that's their perspective. Years ago, I spent time with Yaakov Yach, one of the great Jewish believers of the 20th century. It was a privilege to be mentored by him at all. And I found this line in one of his books in which he said, and yet today, even after the Holocaust, there are still those cold-blooded theologians. Michael Brown, talk about passion. Read his book, Our Hands Are Stained with Blood. If you want to hear passion, read that book. He has in it one of the original declarations that a Jew is supposed to make if they came to faith in Yeshua. And in that declaration, it is a long, convicting statement demanding that they will completely give up their Jewish identity. We're reminded of the tradition of the Marranos, the original Jewish people who were forced to become Christians. And one of their practices was that they were supposed to always keep pork cooking outside the door. It's hard to believe, but I actually met someone who said, this was a family tradition. We did not understand why our grandmother did this, but she literally kept pork cooking outside the door of our home when I was growing up. It's hard to believe these things persisted as they did. And, and this other note. Later conversion became much easier, but the nominal churches were happy to take in Jewish people. The fact is the church turned its back on the crucifixion of Israel. That is really the challenge that we have faced. There is a presumption that the church has a universal culture. In fact, this is what we often saw in churches, that they did not say, well, we have our culture and you have yours and we're still working it out. They'll simply say, well, we're actually universal. Why don't you just become like us? The origins of the church's Eucharist, strangely enough, are totally rooted in the temple. And yet they insist on accusing Israel of being fixed on the letter of the law. And instead what we see today is this. Israel held fast to the covenants, and God today is honoring their covenant faithfulness by returning them back to the land. And although, yes, the Gentiles who come into our faith, they may consider themselves children of Abraham by faith, but God is doing something which he promised to Abraham, and that is he has been faithful to his children too. You know, it wasn't bait and switch. He has been faithful to Abraham too. My friends, I strangely enough, as a Messianic Jew, am often, out of certain circles, called a Judaizer because I preach the gospel to Jewish people and Gentiles, and as a Jew, I live as a Jew. But I want you to remember this. Those Christian denominations who think that they will determine how Jewish people will come into the gospel should remember the words of Paul. He doesn't say, we'll let them back in later. He says, God is able. This is the work of God. And if you have joined a Messianic congregation, you are part of that larger vision. I want to conclude by getting back to Yeshua's view. I know I've spoken at length. This is a complex issue. I want to get back to what did Yeshua instruct us to do. He instructed us not to lose sight of the basics. He continued to tell Israel of their commitment to Torah. I tell you, unless your righteousness is far greater than that of the Torah teachers in Perushim, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. But we don't do that because we are scrupulous. This is how we do it. I tell you the truth, it is to your advantage I go away. If I don't go away, the comforting counselor will not come to you. However, if I do go, I will send him to you. And when he comes, he will show you that the world is wrong about sin, about righteousness, and about judgment. About sin and that people don't put their trust in me. About righteousness and that I am going to the Father. You will no longer see me. And about judgment in that the ruler of this world has been judged. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you. Whether or not we choose to be scrupulous or whether or not we simply choose to live in a freedom guided by the Spirit, we are all guided by the Spirit. That is the challenge. And I can tell you, it's always tough to be guided by the Spirit. I'm going to conclude with one last thing. Last week I talked about Mark chapter 7. I had a great discourse this week with our friend Manny, who came last week. But I want to point out to you there's another story in Mark chapter 7. It's a story of the Syro-Phoenician woman who comes to Yeshua and she pleads for a daughter. She pleads for a daughter who is unclean. And she cries out to him for him to do what only Messiah can do. Now, Yeshua says to her, let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's food and toss it. And here he refers to the Gentiles, as they are often referred to in Jewish culture. But the woman pleads for him further. Even the dogs under the table get the children's leftovers, and he takes pity on her. Get back to the heart of Yeshua. He knew the priority, but then he moved to the larger purpose. She confessed her faith, and so he said, for such an answer, you may go home. The demon has left your daughter. He was opening the way, which Kepha would see and Paul would break through. I want us to take the Lord's table today. We need to take the Lord's table today. What we've talked about are some of the issues that can so easily separate us. Some will insist on scrupulousness. Some will demand their freedom. But what shall we do if we judge one another when we've been called to live in the Spirit? Let us find the unity that Paul cried out for us to have. Whether we consider one weaker or stronger. Whether we consider one superior by righteous actions, or whether or not we just say, Lord, thank God you've got mercy on me, a sinner. Which is pretty much where I see myself. Come and receive what we all need. Not by might, not by power, not by even zeal of righteousness, but by the grace of God and the gift of the Spirit. Hope, life, the mercy of God in Yeshua, who died for us. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we have worked through some tough things today, but it leads us back to the cross of Yeshua. It leads us back to what he did that no one else can do. We need to go there. We have nothing to commend us for our righteousness when we look at the cross. When we look at it, all we see is that we are privileged to receive the mercy of God. But we need to be changed. Changed in our hearts, changed in our attitudes. Let us not be arrogant. Let us not be arrogant because we have one view or another. Let us be open to one another, seeking your face, praying for one another, blessing one another, appreciating that you've made us all distinctly different for a larger purpose. You made Kepha for one ministry, Paul for another. Certainly you've made us different here, and yet you've given us a unity. If we will seek it, hold on to it, and apply your Spirit, even when there are the gaps in our understanding. We pray for your grace. In Yeshua's name, amen.